plenary now with a report back from the three chair people from the workshops. So without further ado, we'll start with the equity workshop with Frank Stillwell reporting back.
Thank you, Hayden, and thanks for the invitation to participate in the session today. I'll stay sitting down if that's all right with you. Our group focused on the question of equity. I began by arguing that sustainability and equity are parallel challenges which interact with each other, and that if we want to create effective and comprehensive social change, it's got to be more than just a transition to a sustainable society, which that is. It's also got to be a just transition. And that requires dealing with the problems of inequality between rich and poor, because it's the concentration of wealth in the hands of a wealthy, powerful elite that is part of the challenge in achieving a sustainable society. How to do it is, of course, the big question, and that's what our discussion focused on. Some of the suggestions were of a bottom-up character. In other words, even in societies that are grossly unequal with concentrations of wealth, there was a strong feeling that people can make a difference through local community activities, through forming cooperatives, including for housing, engaging in practices that are more sustainable and which will help people who are otherwise floundering in an unequal capitalist society. So forming cooperatives, engaging in various forms of community building that create cultural change, in other words, more egalitarian, more solidaristic social practices of various kinds. And as someone said, please no more rhetoric about the quiet Australians, because that's the last thing we need. We want active grassroots movements to be pressing for social change towards a more egalitarian and sustainable society. But there was also some suggestion about the need for new policies from the corporations themselves, pressure brought to bear on the corporation both from outside and from inside to produce technologies and implement technologies that are less environmentally degrading and potentially more equitable in the distribution of the fruits of those economic activities. And as far as governments are concerned, although people in the group were generally rather pessimistic about what's happening to democracy at the moment and the spectre of fascism that sort of lurks inside many of the current developments in our political system worldwide, a feeling that it's not all over, and that government policies which are more progressive, more encouraging of a transition to sustainable societies, some of the sorts of things that Philip Lawn has been talking about for many years, about changing at the metrics by which we measure progress away from crude ones based on gross domestic product to other measures of progress that recognise the importance of taking account of the environment and factoring in questions about equity as well as sustainability. Personally, I never quite got round to putting the case to our group for pressuring governments to embrace a Green New Deal, but I do note that around the world some political leaders are talking seriously about such programs. I'm thinking of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren in the United States, for example, but I shouldn't say anymore because that's going beyond what we actually talked about.
Okay. Thank you very much, and I should say we will type up the notes from the workshops and send it out to everyone. We've got email addresses for them, so if you didn't register online, we won't have your email, so you may need to pass it on to us. So I'm reporting back on the ethics and worldview workshop, because Mark's still getting his voluminous notes written down from their very productive one, so he'll come last. So we had the smallest group, we had just 5 of us, but we had a very interesting discussion. So the key things we wrote down were, how do we change worldview and ethics? And a number of points. And one of them, the key one, was talk about it. That we actually have that dialogue to talk about worldview and ethics, because a number of us had the experience, I certainly have, with teaching students and asking them whether nature has intrinsic value, of that some of them going, oh, I've never been asked to think about that before. So having that dialogue. Another one was being a champion for 3 terms with a sense of wonder, a sense of place that's often involved with that, and also a sense of the sacred in terms of the landscape, although it didn't have universal agreement in the group. So also practical things like engaging farmers with land care and getting them to engage with nature through land care and other forums such as that. Also getting children out into nature, particularly younger than age 12, when it has been argued by a lot of educators like Edith Cobb that if a child doesn't form that connection with nature by age 12, it becomes much harder for them later on to form that bond. So that connection through education, and that can be done a number of ways. One, we could change the curriculum and the syllabuses to actually mandate trips out into nature, which, for instance, Finland does. But we could also, in the curriculum, we can discuss ethics, wonder, ecological economics, and the term we came up with, civics, in terms of discussion about community and how that operates as a culture, and also philosophy. But also we can have greener and better designed cities for us to engage with nature. And in fact, there is actually a group of academics such as Marcus Foth up in Queensland who are now talking about post-anthropocentric cities. In other words, designing cities to engage people with nature far more closely. Also the use of arts, creativity and imagination, with right through from children right through to adults, in terms of using that. People often talk about left brain, right brain interaction, but to actually use that in terms of engaging with nature and ethics. And there's also in terms of learning from First Nations people. There is a term Didiri from Northwest Australia, which is essentially contemplation, empathy, listening to place, and learning from that kinship ethics and Aboriginal law to protect life is certainly something that in Australia, particularly because we have such excellent First Nations people still remaining, that we can learn a tremendous amount from. But there's also other practical things we do, such as deep ecology workshops, Council of All Beings, also rites of passage, which were common in the US with Indigenous peoples, but is also happening around the world, in terms of particularly around puberty, having children going out into nature, but also teaching science in a holistic way that is not necessarily all about using resources, but in fact engaging with the wealth of life on Earth. Now also an increasing term at the moment is Earth jurisprudence. In other words, that the rights of nature are incorporated into law. And in fact, you've got the example of the Wanganui River in New Zealand that now has 2 guardians appointed, one from the government, one from the iwi, or the tribe, the Maori tribe. And the Australian Earth Laws Alliance does a lot of work in terms of earth jurisprudence. Also, we've actually covered the more engagement, I guess, is, as the term was used, actually having the humility to learn from Indigenous peoples in terms of what they've learned from living with the land for so long. One thing we raised just at the end was the idea of the problem in Western ideas, particularly of ownership and control, versus being a custodian that learns from the land. Well, we didn't have a lot of time to go through that in great discussion, but it was something we thought was a key thing we needed to also cover. So essentially, those were the key points we thought which would help to change the worldview and ethics in society. So thank you, and move on to Mark.
Right. Do you want me to hold something up? Yeah. You can see from the budget sheets that our group was highly productive, and I'm still trying to get my head around all the fantastic suggestions. But special thanks to Wayne for taking all these notes. So our group was about how to start moving towards an ecologically sustainable planet. And one of the first points that was made very strongly is that it's very hard we can't separate that from an ethical economic system and a socially just economic system. They really are closely bound up. And steady state economics contains values and therefore contains ethics, questions of what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad. So having said that, we recognise that the existing society, the existing system, has been feeding us a false and destructive story about who we are and where we're going, and that we need a new story, a new narrative, or what one of our members called a social imaginary. And we need to make this new story about where we're going something that is supported widely, that is commonly supported, a new story. So that's quite a challenge, how to do that. One suggestion was to create, at least in the context of dealing with the affluence term in I = PAT, I prefer to call it the consumption per person term, is to create a story of consumer shame. And we were told about flight shame in Sweden, where there is a movement to make people, encourage people, nudge people to hesitate to fly places and rather take other forms of transport. So similarly, the idea would be to encourage consumer shame, not retail therapy, but perhaps the opposite. But to do this, of course, would have employment implications. So it can't stand alone. It would have to be combined with other measures to, for example, reduce the number of hours in the working week, to encourage job sharing, and perhaps to create a universal basic income so that people could still survive. So this is, you might think of this consumer shame approach as a kind of a cultural response, but when we started talking about the main barriers, we also recognised that some of the primary barriers come from, are basically political barriers, not just in terms of party politics, but politics defined broadly in terms of power structures. And there we recognise, all of us recognise, there are very powerful structures in our society. The fossil fuel industry, of course, has been mentioned, which is so powerful that it even brought our leading ministers at the time to take a nice piece of coal into Parliament House, supplied in form of a lacquered piece of coal from the Minerals Council, so that the politicians wouldn't get their hands dirty carrying it. So the political barriers are very strong, and I think we agree that they arise to a large degree from the power of very large corporations and other bodies like the Minerals Council of Australia, which unite these bodies. So, and of course, to cut to the chase, if we want to move towards a more sustainable planet, and in particular a steady state economy, we have to address these power structures. And therefore, a lot of the discussion wasn't about economics, but it was about really how to weaken the power of corporations, both directly and indirectly, as they're reflected in Parliament. So, some obvious things. Putting much tighter constraints or eliminating entirely political donations. And that means, of course, that we would have to fund, we taxpayers would have to fund elections. Fair enough. We have to deal much more strongly with the revolving door, where a Minister for Energy, when he or she retires, can move into a position with the Minerals Council of Australia, with some other body that's promoting fossil fuels. And that's actually been happening. Both major parties are involved in that. I would add that we need a federal ICAC, an independent Commission Against Corruption. We need to review the Corporations Act, which gives enormous power to corporations at the expense of the public at large. Maybe we should consider limited terms for politicians, maybe limiting their time in Parliament for 2 years so they don't have so much time to establish strong relationships with vested interests outside of Parliament. Although it was pointed out that the disadvantage is that sometimes you get someone really terrific, like an Obama, at least in the US, that you might want to keep for longer. Too bad, I would argue, personally. And of course, we have to look at the situation of our bureaucrats who serve the government process in Australia. There's been a steady loss of their independence from the political arm in Australia. Maybe there should be more independence. We didn't really have time to discuss other ways of reducing barriers by cutting through, by putting caps on pollution, for example, through environmental taxes and by carbon pricing and so on. That would have required a lot more time. Now, the actions that I've listed, though, the political actions of reducing the power of the corporations and the bodies that support them, can be explained to the public in much broader terms than trying to explain a steady state economy. They have enormous benefits in terms of reducing corruption, which is a little more subtle in Australia than it might be in countries like India perhaps, but is there very strongly. So I think we could sell a lot of these, I shouldn't have used that word, it was a Freudian slip, but we could educate people to support a lot of these measures. Now, just very briefly, because I can see time is marching on, another area when we're addressing the affluence or consumption per person term is to improve, to push for policies to improve the efficiency of generation and use of energy, of water, our use of land. All these things, if you examine them closely, are very inefficient from a fairly, even a conventional economics view, but also from a broader view of the system. Efficiencies in these areas would have enormous benefits in terms of economic welfare. There is an issue. Improving efficiency leads to what's called the rebound effect, which means that if you save money through an efficiency measure, you're going to spend it in some other way. So efficiency measures, the rebound can be overcome by combining efficiency measures with measures to nudge people to spend their money in environmentally sound ways. So, for example, you can encourage businesses to supply energy efficiency programs to homes and offices and buildings and industries, and combine that so that the money saved with energy efficiency is invested in renewable energy rather than in buying huge diesel-powered motorboats or something like that. The issue of rental accommodation was raised because more and more people are moving to that stage, and there we could take some advice from what's happening in Canberra. So that in Canberra, if you want to sell a house, and I think now, but I may be wrong, and maybe Francie can correct me, if you rent a house, you have to provide an energy audit. You certainly have to do for sales at the house. And that energy audit is a public document, and it has to go in the sales document, it should go in the rental document. The ACT is the only jurisdiction in Australia, to my knowledge, that has such a requirement. And although some of us have pushed for it in New South Wales, there hasn't been much response. So these are specific issues that will push us in the right direction for a steady state economy, a more sustainable planet. But they have multiple benefits: social justice benefits, environmental benefits, and even conventional economic benefits in many cases. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Okay, we're running out. I think they're actually going to turn the lights off at 1:15. So we're going to have to roll it up there. I will say, in terms of where we go from here, we will type up all those points and make them available. And in terms of Cassie New South Wales in the future, this has been a big project we've been working on for a long time. For those of you who haven't seen it, we also have a survey that you can find on our website that's a survey about ecologically sustainable economy, but if you haven't filled it in, please do. And we'll certainly be looking at what's come out of today in terms of what Cassie New South Wales does in the future. And I think because the time is so short, I'll just do a quick thank you to everyone involved. Phil Lawns had to head back to Adelaide, but it was wonderful to have him speak here, and I got some really nice feedback, and wonderful to have Frank and Mark here in the workshops. And I think it may not have been hundreds and hundreds of people packing in here, but in terms of the quality of interaction and what came out of it, I think it was a very successful day.